The house has house rules, the city has city rules, the forest has forest rules. But the forest cannot speak to us. So, who will communicate with us when we break the forest rules? Because of the haunting experience I am going to tell you about today, it is an incident that occurred in a forest that has now been established as a national park. At the time of the incident, Smith and another friend hired a Kerrang tribal hunter to guide them on a hunting trip in the forest. However, one of the traveling companions ended up doing something that violated the ways of the local people, resulting in them barely escaping the forest alive. This story is titled Cursed Mountain. Before we dive into our scary story, we would like to ask everyone to like and subscribe to support us in continuing to bring you more terrifying tales in the future. For today, we are here with Smith's haunting experience. The whole event took place in a forest where, several years ago, there were news reports about a government helicopter crash in that area. I'll just say that this incident involves two ethnic groups, the Karyong and the Kerrang. I'm confident that most people are not very familiar with these two tribes. In fact, these two groups come from the same tribe but have different ways of life. The Karyong live at the foot of the mountain, easily accessible, and communicate with outsiders normally. On the other hand, the Kerrang live on the mountain. Going back to around 1995, the forest where the incident took place had not yet been designated as a national park like it is today. The main people involved in this story are a photographer named Smith and Chris, who had lived abroad for many years and developed a habit of hunting in the forest, following foreign customs. Chris's attitude was such that whenever he hunted, he would stand with his rifle and pose with the animal he had hunted. His original name wasn't Chris, it was Git. When he moved abroad, people there mispronounced it until it became Chris. At that time, Chris wanted to go into the forest to hunt and take pictures in the way he liked. Smith, the photographer, suggested a place to Chris and asked to join in just to take photos. He wanted to capture the way of life of the Kerrang people and the state of the forest at that time. The two of them hired a Kerrang hunter named Tion to guide them into the forest to hunt. The area they were entering had to pass through a part of the forest known as the Cursed Mountain. During that journey, they stayed at a Karyong village, where there happened to be a wedding-like event. Seeing this, Chris and his companions went to observe and asked to take pictures. They saw coins being thrown on the ground and into the water. Chris, being outspoken, asked Tion, "How much is the dowry here?" Tion replied that what they saw was the dowry. A bot on the ground, a bot in the water, signifying the completion of the ceremony. Upon hearing this, Chris joked that if he lived in this village, he could probably ask for any woman in the village as his wife, noting how the brides were young and beautiful. Chris joked carelessly due to his habit of spending money to get what he wanted. Chris was indeed a big spender, even covering all the expenses for Smith on this trip. They agreed to start their journey at 6 a.m., planning to stay in the forest for 2 nights. Hunter Tion laid down 3 rules for the trip. First, regarding noise, no loud sounds, no talking, no shooting unless Tion allowed it, and they had to stay as quiet as possible. Second, they must not stray from the group. If they needed to go anywhere, they had to inform each other, and if they had to relieve themselves, they had to ask the spirits of the forest for permission. If Tion didn't tell them to stop walking, they couldn't stop. If he told them to run, they had to run. Essentially, they had to follow Tion's instructions. Lastly, if anyone got injured or couldn't continue, they had to return immediately, even for minor injuries like a sprained ankle. Everyone agreed to these terms. The next morning, before leaving the village, everyone prepared their necessary supplies. Chris joined the group late because he was busy preparing his guns and ammunition. Shortly after starting their journey, Chris encountered a Karyong mother and her child. As they passed, he grabbed the child's hand, patted their head, and gave them some candy he had brought along. However, the mother reacted angrily, almost violently. She yelled at Chris, but he couldn't understand her. Finally, Tian mediated, secretly giving the mother some money. Chris, frustrated, complained about how greedy these people were, just because he wanted to give candy to the child. Tian explained that it was a local custom that children under 15 should not be touched, as it was considered inappropriate, akin to molestation. Fortunately, there were no other people around at that time, so the matter was easily resolved. Before entering the forest, Hunter Tian told them that they had to perform a forest opening ceremony. Upon hearing this, Chris made a gesture as if opening a door and joked, "Here, the forest is open." But the hunter did not laugh or show any sign of amusement. Instead, he walked up and lightly pushed Chris's chest and asked, "Do you have a knife? Did you bring a knife?" Then he noticed the knife strapped to Chris's leg, reached over, and took it out, which made Chris uncomfortable. Hunter Tian started the forest opening ceremony, which wasn't very complicated. He instructed everyone to sit down and light incense to pay their respects. Then he stuck the knife into the ground and dug up some dirt 2 to 3 times. After that, he told everyone to pick some leaves from the area and turn them over several times while making a wish, asking for permission to enter the forest, promising not to disrespect it, and asking for mercy to catch some animals. Chris just watched the ceremony without making any wish as the hunter instructed. Finally, Tian said the ceremony was complete, and they began their journey into the forest. After walking for a while, they encountered a young monk, about 20-something years old, accompanied by a Kerrang disciple. The monk intended to walk to the village on the mountain. Chris and Smith paid their respects to the monk, and Chris said, "Wow, you're so young and brave to meditate in the forest. Do you have any protective amulets? Can I have one to take into the forest?" The monk replied, "I am not from here, but I was invited for a ceremony." He then told Chris that he didn't have any protective amulets, but reminded him that every place has its own rules. The house has house rules, the city has city rules, and the forest has forest rules, but the forest cannot speak to us. The only one who can speak to you is this hunter. This statement served as a warning for both of them to listen to Hunter Tian. After this encounter, Chris's group and the monk went their separate ways. After following Tian for a while, Chris suddenly took out a sticky rice steamer basket and put it on his head like a hat. The hunter asked him where he got it, and Chris said he bought it before leaving the village, thinking it was nice and could be used as a hat and for cooking rice. Tian remarked to Smith, "Your friend likes to do strange things." But Chris paid no attention to the comment. After walking in the forest for a while, they met a villager carrying a live chicken into the forest. Chris thought that if they couldn't hunt anything, it would be good to have a chicken with them. He asked Tian for permission to attend to personal matters and soon returned with a slaughtered chicken. He told the hunter that he bought it from the villager, but Tian gave him a strange look and warned him, "You did something without telling me again. We are about to enter the dense forest now. Don't do anything like this again." On the first night of camping in the forest, they cooked and ate as usual. The rice they ate that night was from the Karyong people, which had small grains. Tian and Smith ate the food they brought with them, while Chris ate the roasted chicken alone. The reason Smith didn't eat the chicken was because he had gout. After finishing dinner, everyone went to sleep on their platforms. However, Since Chris couldn't sleep, he got up to smoke a cigarette. While smoking, he heard someone calling Hunter Tion from below. When he looked down, he saw another hunter. At that moment, Tion looked down and they spoke in the Kerang language, which Chris couldn't understand. During their conversation, Chris noticed a woman who had come with the hunter below. He felt an immediate attraction to her and wondered what special qualities Kerang hunters had to have such beautiful wives. He stared at the woman, who smiled at him before walking away with the hunter. In the middle of the night, after everyone had fallen asleep, Chris remained restless, unable to get used to sleeping on the platform. While tossing and turning, he suddenly heard a voice from below calling, "Plak Yaw, Plak Yaw." He didn't know what the words meant, but he got up and peeked down to see the same woman who had been with the hunter earlier that evening. She was wearing a knee-length dress-like garment. Curious about why she was calling him, Chris decided to go down to talk to her. The mysterious woman called out to Chris again, this time asking him to come down. Believing she posed no threat, Chris climbed down from the platform to speak with her. He learned that she was not the hunter's wife but his sister, who often accompanied her brother into the forest. Since Chris was already fond of her, he reached out to hold her hand to gauge her reaction. When their hands touched, she did not pull away or reprimand him, so he went further and put his arm around her shoulders. She remained passive, leading Chris to believe she might have feelings for him too. He invited her to drink with him, and they spent the night talking and drinking. As Chris fetched some leftover grilled chicken to eat with the alcohol, the woman's expression suddenly changed when she saw the chicken. Chris asked if something was wrong, but she started backing away, saying, "I can't stay. My brother will find out. I'll come back tomorrow." She then hurriedly left, leaving Chris alone and confused. The next morning, they resumed their journey. While walking, Chris told Smith about meeting the hunter's sister, but omitted the part about holding hands and putting his arm around her, fearing Tion's reprimand. That morning, Chris was surprised to find his arms and hands burning painfully, which made him worry about how he would pull the trigger to hunt. His anxiety was evident because they only had one day left to hunt. As the hunter had said, they would only walk back and were not allowed to use guns on the return trip. Chris was also thinking about the hunter's sister, wanting to get to know her better. After walking for a while, they suddenly heard a loud noise throughout the forest, known as the forest cracking. It sounded like a landslide, with trees breaking and water rushing as if there was an earthquake. Birds flew up from the trees in alarm. Everyone looked at each other in confusion, unsure of what was happening. The most startled of the group was Hunter Tion. Once the noise subsided, the forest animals began to cry out in a frenzy before everything fell silent, so quiet that they could hear each other's breathing. When everything calmed down, Tion let out a deep sigh and led them further into the forest, repeatedly muttering, "Visa Chu, Visa Chu." He kept mumbling all the way until he suddenly turned to them and said, "We have to cancel all hunting. The forest guardian has forbidden it." Upon hearing this, Chris immediately protested, "What? We've already paid, and the forest has been opened. Why can't we hunt now? What's the big deal with this forest guardian?" It seemed as though Hunter Tion only partially understood what Chris was complaining about. While Chris was standing and ranting, the weather in the forest suddenly became turbulent. A strong gust of wind blew, followed by a torrential downpour as if the sky had burst open. The three of them immediately ran to find shelter from the rain. Once they found a suitable place to take cover, Hunter Tion turned to Smith and remarked that he hadn't encountered weather like this since he was a child. Intrigued, Smith asked Tion what had happened when he was a child. Tion recounted that such an event had occurred once when he was young because someone in his village had violated a sacred tradition. This violation involved a man having an affair with a woman without following the proper local custom of courtship and marriage. The violator was then banished from the village and fled into the forest. After that day, no one ever saw the man again. While Tion and Smith set up a tarp, Chris climbed onto a high rock. Suddenly, he spotted a cobra slithering by, seemingly trying to avoid the rainwater flowing down the rock. Smith saw that the snake wasn't threatening Chris at all. Before Smith could say anything, Chris broke a forked stick, pinned the snake's head to the ground, and stabbed it with his knife, shouting, "Oh no, the snake was about to bite me." Smith witnessed the entire scene and knew the cobra hadn't posed any danger to Chris. Upon hearing the commotion, Hunter Tion rushed over, horrified by what Chris had done. Tion cried out, "Why didn't you tell me you saw a snake? I could have caught it. Why did you have to stab it in the head like that?" After speaking, Tion asked Chris for the snake's carcass, but Chris refused, claiming that since he killed it, he should keep it. He argued that he hadn't been allowed to shoot any other animals and deserved to take the snake's skin home. A struggle over the snake ensued between Tion and Chris, leaving Smith unsure of what to do. Sensing the situation was deteriorating, Smith stepped in to negotiate with Chris. Tion's behavior was so bizarre, he was crying hysterically, that Smith couldn't understand why killing one snake had caused such a reaction. After some negotiation, Chris cut out the snake's gallbladder, putting it in a small liquor glass he carried. Tion took the remaining carcass, placed it in a tree, and muttered something under his breath. He then cried again, shouting "Visa Chu" into the rain, and knelt to the ground in reverence. As the rain began to subside, a profound silence enveloped the forest once more, punctuated by the distant sound of a herd of elephants. Hearing this, Chris remarked, "Wow, what a pity. Coming all this way into the forest, I hope to see elephants at least once. But from the sound of it, they must be quite far away." From their vantage point, they could see the herd of elephants approaching. Suddenly, the elephants changed direction and veered away. Hunter Tion, observing this, told them that they had to leave the forest by the next day. That evening, everyone went to bed separately, each feeling their own sense of disappointment. Hunter Tion was disheartened because he couldn't deliver what he was hired to do. Smith regretted bringing his friend along. However, Chris seemed unfazed, casually drinking alcohol while waiting for a woman who had promised to visit him that night. Chris drank alone until late at night when he finally heard the woman's voice. She approached and sat with him, just as she had on the first night. Chris flirted with her, asking how to say love in her language. She shyly responded, "Ya ana," which means, "I love you." After some time, she suddenly said, "Elephant." Chris mentioned hearing elephant sounds earlier, and as he spoke, she pointed to the small glass containing the snake gall. She gestured to indicate that he shouldn't drink it because it was bad. From Smith's perspective, he was awakened by a piercing scream. Both he and Hunter Tion climbed down and found Chris sitting stiffly with a mysterious woman, who was speaking rapidly in the local dialect. She then stood up and dragged Chris into the forest with immense strength. Tion and Smith chased after them until Chris was forcefully slammed into a tree, and the woman disappeared into the forest. Another hunter appeared out of nowhere and spoke with Tion in their dialect. Meanwhile, Chris, who had been slammed against the tree, lay unconscious with a vacant stare. They had to wait until morning, during which Chris kept vomiting a foul-smelling liquid mixed with blood. He also convulsed, urinated, and defecated in his pants. One of the hunters instructed Tion to fetch a wandering monk. Tion returned after a long while with the monk, who began chanting prayers. Smith, witnessing his friend's dire state, broke down in tears, confessing to the monk that he regretted bringing Chris here. He explained that Chris had come back to Thailand to attend his son's ordination, and if he couldn't make it, Smith would feel guilty for life. The monk, moved by Smith's words, continued praying with tears in his eyes. After the prayers, he said he had done all he could. Tion then fetched a chicken brought by the monk's disciple, slaughtered it, and began a ritual to bring Chris back to the village. After the ritual, they carried Chris out of the forest, where he regained consciousness at the forest edge. The first thing Tion made Chris do was perform a ritual to leave the forest properly. They returned to the spot where they had initially dug up the earth with a knife and buried it back, placing the leaves they had turned over back to their original position. Chris spent 2 days recuperating in the Karyong village until he regained his senses. He recounted to Smith that after being dragged into the forest and slammed against the tree, he was pulled deeper into the jungle, seeing his friends chasing after him. His body was scratched by thorns and slammed into trees until he reached a clearing. There, he tried to see who was dragging him. Chris described seeing a huge figure that shrank in size, grabbed chickens, and forced them into his mouth as if he wasn't human. This coincided with the time he was convulsing and vomiting the foul liquid. Unable to resist, Chris could only look around in bewilderment. Outside the cave, he saw a dense forest with the sounds of wild animals, seemingly waiting to devour him. He blacked out and only regained consciousness in the forest, where the monk asked him to promise to ordain his son there. Upon agreeing, he felt himself being thrown out of the cave, regaining full awareness only after leaving the forest. Immediately upon regaining consciousness, Chris thanked the monk and all the hunters. He then confessed that the rice steamer he had used as a hat was not bought but taken from a stump where villagers left important items for the dead. Additionally, the word sang the woman mentioned actually meant chicken in the Karyong language, not elephant. Chris also admitted that the chicken he took wasn't bought from villagers, but taken from an offering left for the forest spirits. After seeing the offering, Chris had taken the chicken without telling anyone. Translate the following text into English without summarizing, condensing, or omitting any part of it. Chris confessed at that moment. Both the hunter and the monk spoke in unison, saying that the forest spirits were already being very lenient to let him out of the forest. The monk then recounted that he was not from there, and the reason he cried was that his father had once trekked through this forest and experienced a similar incident. His father had then asked him to become a monk and go on a pilgrimage to help the Karang people, in order to extend his father's lifespan. However, within less than half a year, his father passed away while repeatedly saying, "Visa Jew, Visa Jew." Later, it was understood that these words meant sorry. And when the hunter Tion uttered these words and kept mumbling them throughout the journey, it was to apologize to the forest spirits on behalf of Chris.